Brian Wilson, cultural visionary, musical genius, and one of the most significant and impressive artists of the 20th century, has passed away at 82 years old. In this video, I want to look at what it was that made Brian so different than his peers. Where did that genius come from, and what choices did he make in his epic life that helped shape his final legacy? Welcome back, friends, to the Raised by Hippies YouTube channel. I'm Vanessa, and today we're going to be taking a look at the life and legacy of Brian Wilson, with a specific look at his work with the Beach Boys and how they contributed something priceless and essential to the development of music in the 20th century. If you're a Beach Boys fan or you just dig hearing stories from the history of music in the 20th century, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell to see all the new videos, and drop a comment telling me your favorite Beach Boys or Brian Wilson story. And over on my Patreon account, I'm going to be doing a deeper analysis of a couple of my favorite Brian Wilson songs, so pop over there and check it out. Now, our first stop is Inglewood, California, late June 1942. Brian Wilson was the oldest son of Audrey and Murray Wilson, a machinist who had dreams of becoming a songwriter. When he was a child, his father was astonished when he realized that his son had the ability to learn music entirely by ear and reproduce it perfectly. He had a gift, which was later confirmed by his choir instructor, who discovered that he had perfect pitch. While his younger brothers, Carl and Dennis, were getting into jazz and R&B, Brian was into show tunes like George Gershwin and American classic folk songs. Their father pushed them to start making music together, because he could see that there was no way in any universe that Brian was not meant to be a successful musician. There are mixed stories about the way that Murray Wilson treated his boys, specifically Brian, but all three of them made claims that their father was strict to the point of cruelty, driven by determination to make them great. And they were great. The Beach Boys were one of the foundational groups in this new form of popular music that would take over the 20th century. They were at the forefront, along with Jan and Dean and the Ventures, of the surf rock explosion, bringing a new angle to rock music in America 2 to 3 years before the British invasion. They were the sound of California, and everybody envied Brian's effortless talent. But the thing about Brian Wilson was, as effortless as it may have seemed, he suffered so much for his art. It wasn't long before Phil Spector crossed his mind and changed his perspective on making music forever. Now there was a goal, a person to beat, someone to admire and aspire to be like. As a creator of music, not as a human being, for the love of God. But that fixation drove him to the brink of insanity.
In terms of what, as somebody who has written so many great songs yourself, what do you think is the greatest pop song ever written?
I'll probably Be My Baby by the Ronettes. Be the best one I think that I know of.
And you and Phil, you've admired Phil Spector for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, for a long time.
What is it about Phil Spector's sound that really does it for you?
Well, he gets the musicians play real hard, you know, and he builds a foundation of a wall of sound that he makes.
Brian Wilson, what it's like to get the Spector band. He's still, at age 65, going through craziness. Dreaming, playing Be My Baby every morning, he writes, you know, going crazy, you know, figuring out, I mean, he's a little cuckoo over it.
Well, the Beatles arrived in New York today and advanced almost to the Hudson.
In early 1964, when the Beatles stepped off plane in New York City, Brian's world would change again. While Phil Spector was something to be admired as far as his use of layering dozens of instruments to build a wall of sound, the Beatles were the opposite. Simple in all their complexity, the beautiful melodies of John Lennon and Paul McCartney were mind-blowing to people like Brian, who previously had had the title as top hitmaker in this category of music. But more than just their music, it was their personalities when it came to the Beatles, and all of the British invasion bands, really. They brought their rough English exteriors into their interpretations of classic American blues songs, and they had a kind of swagger that the Beach Boys could only aspire to. While the Wilsons were still wearing collars and had clean-cut hair, these Brits were showing up looking shaggy, and they could fight as hard as they could rock. This was a whole new ballgame.
May I have, I'm sure most everybody knows, but for anybody who might not, may we introduce you by name?
Al Jardine.
Thank you, Al.
Dennis Wilson.
Thank you.
Brian Wilson.
Carl Wilson.
Mike Love. Now, I think, what happened? There you are. How long has this singing been going on?
About 3 years now.
You know, it's an amazing thing because you have hit after hit. Who determines, Brian, what will be done next?
Well, I guess I do. I don't know. I write the songs and produce them, so I have a lot to say about it.
Do you have like a corporate setup? Does everybody have a vote? Can you vote him out and down if you don't like his idea?
Well, yes, we do, but he usually has good ideas.
And it really got to Brian. The Beach Boys were incredibly famous. It's not like they weren't. They were one of the most successful bands of the period. They'd have 5 top 40 singles in 1964 alone. And by the end of the year, they dropped a well-received Christmas album, which included their popular cover of Little Saint Nick. But all of this only added to the pressure, and in December of that year, Brian had a severe panic attack on an airplane, which at the time, they were calling a nervous breakdown. Brian subsequently withdrew from touring and focused his work solely on what he could do in the studio. As a result of this, his work became very introspective. In 1965, he wrote and produced The Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights, with songs like Help Me Rhonda, California Girls. It was clear that the group were shifting into a new era of songwriting for their resident genius, Brian Wilson. Later that year, Brian would take psychedelic drugs for the first time. He claimed that during this experience that he heard the voice of God tell him directly to write the greatest rock and roll album of all time. The album that he would thus create was Pet Sounds, his masterpiece, inspired by his biggest influences and rivals, Phil Spector and the Beatles. Rubber Soul had really rocked his world. Later that year, in 1966, the Beach Boys would release Good Vibrations, their biggest and largely considered to be their best and most iconic hit. The song is near perfect, the Pocket Symphony, Brian's version of the Wall of Sound. It was the perfect display of his ability to create perfection in a studio setting. By this time, most of the Beach Boys' music was being performed by the Wrecking Crew, the most famous group of session musicians in the world.
I think that Brian admired us, and wanted kind of approval from us. And so he played this multiple track of him singing all different kind of parts. And it was that without instruments, of course. It's the 15, 20 track thing of him singing. And it was so gorgeous. And then Barney turns around to him, cute, he said, Brian, that's great. I mean, I take back everything I ever thought about you. With every record that we did. At first it was the Beach Boys, surf rock, stuff like that. Then it got better and better and better.
Wrote a song that we recorded, and it was in 2 different keys at the same time. There were 2 keys going at the same time, but he mastered that. And so did Brian. And I remember going around the room in the studio looking at everybody's music, thinking, why am I playing the key of D and you're in the key of A? And it worked, but not until the record had gelled and all the parts were fit into place. Trying all this screwball stuff, but he'd make it come off somehow. But whatever we did session-wise was remarkable. The music was just amazing.
After the success of Pet Sounds, Brian shifted his focus to a project called Smile. This was meant to be sort of a magnum opus for him, something to top Pet Sounds in its success and cultural impact. But this was also a time when Brian was drowning in substance abuse and the resulting mental health issues this sort of chemical excess had caused. He was spinning out, and the following year in 1967, when everybody was celebrating the summer of love, Brian Wilson withdrew from the studio and the public completely. The Beach Boys still continued to record albums, but Brian's contribution to their music was becoming more and more sporadic. And by the end of the 60s, he was exhibiting signs and would be later diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, including symptoms like paranoia, hallucinations, and drastic mood swings. People began to take advantage of him, and by the time the Beach Boys were back in the studio in 1971, he was a shadow of what he'd once been.
I was over at the studio in Santa Monica, and you were doing quite a lot of recording there at that point, and then took some of the material up to Caribou. Now, there are about 3 or 4 tracks that were kind of half finished at that point. Are they going to be among the things that are going to be used?
Those 3 or 4 tracks, do you remember any of the titles?
I don't remember titles, except that one is related to water very closely. It's a river thing.
Oh, that was Dennis's song.
That's right.
The river song, right, the riverboat song.
Yeah.
That's complete, yes. Most of those things that you heard are complete now. So we're rolling away.
So when do you think that'll be finished now?
Well, it should be finished. Like I say, we should have the album done by September. Hopefully, and It should be a good album. It should be a very good album. I'm going to call the album Brian's in Love. I don't think they'll go for it, though.
Throughout the first half of the 70s, Brian Wilson was in a state of total functional decline. He took way too many drugs, he neglected his health and his relationships, and his band members were becoming desperate. Around 1976, they hired the famous yet controversial psychologist Eugene Landy to help bring Brian back from the brink and help him get back to the studio, and even possibly the stage. Landy implemented an extreme regimen, 24/7 supervision, forced diet and exercise, and drug detox. And it sort of worked. Brian temporarily improved enough to get back to work with the band, but something was off about Landy's intense, controlling nature. The band ended up firing him in 1977 due to high fees and concerns over his authoritarian methods and whether he'd crossed a line into taking advantage of Brian rather than helping him. The band launched this Brian's Back promotional campaign, and it sort of worked. The band had a pretty successful run in the late 70s. But without that intense control that Landy was forcing Brian to adhere to, he quickly fell back into drug abuse and lost control once again of his mental and physical health. It's not to say that Landy wasn't taking advantage of Brian. He very likely was. It's more that Brian needed help. He needed someone to be in control, and he had no one around him who was up for the task.
I think rock and roll music is the greatest kind of music for the soul there is in the whole world. And we primarily try to stay rock. We're a rock group with a rock show. Our concerts all rock, you know, most of it's rock and roll. We're a family. We're a family. We know we are. We're just a bunch of brothers and cousins, you know.
In 1982, in a desperate attempt to save Brian's life, the band and his wife Marilyn rehired Landy. He came back into Brian's life and continued the previous regimen of strict diet, detox, and limited social interaction, while undergoing intense psychiatric treatment. Things were starting to turn around for him until 1983, when tragedy struck the band in a way that they would never expect.
Tuesday, the 29th of December, 1983. We are still waiting for the results of an autopsy performed today on the body of Dennis Wilson. He was the drummer of the Beach Boys. Los Angeles Sheriff's deputies now say he'd been drinking with friends all yesterday afternoon before diving into the 58-degree water off Marina del Rey in suburban Los Angeles.
The loss of Dennis, Brian's little brother, was devastating for everyone and would forever change the dynamic of the Beach Boys. Between the grief, Landy's control, and his unstable mental health, Brian withdrew once again. In 1988, the Beach Boys released a totally different kind of song. Totally different than anything Brian would have written. Kokomo, a collaboration between Mike Love, John Phillips, Scott McKenzie, and Terry Melcher. The song was a huge success and brought the band back to the forefront as a classic act in the progressive 80s. But Brian was not all that impressed. It was a good marketing move, is all he is known to have said.
I burned my brain out. My brain got burned out, and nothing left in my brain, you know.
You really think?
I turned into a vegetable over drugs, yeah. A lot of brain damage. Real lot of brain damage.
In 1991, following legal intervention from Brian's family and the state of California, Landy was banned from contacting Brian, and his medical license was permanently revoked. Brian started to recover, and it wasn't long before he met Melinda Ledbetter, the woman who would change his life and bring him back from the edge of disintegration. The two were married in 1995. They got Brian some authentic psychiatric care and on a more appropriate schedule for medication. It was through this that Brian Wilson was able to not just stay alive, but thrive and create music again for the next 30 years. In 1996, Brian Wilson resumed live performance, starting with a short solo tour in the US and the UK, and subsequently he released several solo albums, including a reworked, finally finished version of Smile, the album that he'd abandoned so many years earlier. In 2012, he reunited with the Beach Boys for their 50th anniversary, contributing to the album That's Why God Made the Radio, and an international tour. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, he continued to tour, often performing Pet Sounds and Smile in full with his his band. I think for a lot of people who didn't grow up with the Beach Boys, there's a common misconception about the music. It's a bit too square, too sweet, not rock and roll enough, too poppy, etc. But what you realize as you learn more about their music and people as you get older is that the Beach Boys laid the groundwork for everything. They were a major influence for everybody, simply due to the fact that Brian Wilson was such a mind-blowing genius when it came to music and sound. Thank you so much for watching. Now click the link in my bio, pop over to my Patreon account for an in-depth analysis of a couple of Brian's most iconic songs. And don't forget, if you like the video, to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth looks at some of the most influential and important music artists of the 20th century.